right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Big Ideas in App Architecture. I'm your host, Tim Vale, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Dan Goldin, the chief architect of a company called TripleLift. Dan, welcome to the show. I love to get started by, hearing a little bit about you, kind of your background, and certainly, what you're doing today at TripleLift. Tell everybody kind of what TripleLift is and how you got there. I think is a great way to start, just to get things kicked off.
Sounds good. First of all, thank you for having me. Like I mentioned before, I listened to a lot of the previous episodes, and I hope I can do at least as well and be as interesting to the other listeners. So no pressure. So once again, I'm Dan. I had an interesting, story. So my dad is a self-taught computer programmer. He was a chemist, and he got super into computers when I was a kid. So we emigrated from the Soviet Union in '89, and I think as soon as we could afford it, he bought a computer. The green text on the black monitor. Pre-EGA, I don't know, it's like EGA, CGA, like something along those lines, pre-everything. And so I always got exposed to it, played the games, got in and around middle school. And I actually think that's a really good time, right? Because I saw sort of the before era and then the post era, dealing with dial-up, taking forever for images to load. In college, you suddenly get exposed to fast bandwidth, like that whole jazz. So in college, I really had a similar mindset. For me, it was, hey, my dad could teach himself code. I've always liked computers, but let me focus on something else. So I studied a bit of math econ, used that to get a few roles after college, and it was called quantitative engineer, but these days it's data science, right? So I joke, I was doing data science before it was called data science. I worked at a couple of companies, ranging from a company that did a lot of sort of data analysis for pharmaceutical companies. So that's when I had to learn to use the tape drives and loading data and extracting them, running all sorts of analytics. Did a little stint in the quantitative finance world in the 2008 era, right? Where, sort of maybe we're in this era right now. Hopefully not.
Yes. And I do want to talk about that, by the way. At some point, I want to kind of hear a little bit more about your experience there. Because, yeah, you're right. I think we're entering kind of uncharted territories at uncertain times. So we'll definitely come back to that.
I was a bit naive then, but for me, it was interesting, right? Because it was, the usual day-to-day suddenly got interrupted. And you're like, hey, I'm suddenly doing these new interesting things. Obviously, it's now in hindsight, I'm it's terrible for other people affected. Yeah. But on a personal level, I'm hey, I got to do some new interesting things. At that point, I also realized finance wasn't for me. I joined this company in New York called YOLO, about 200 people, doing pretty similar things, quantum engineering. I got exposed a little bit to advertising. And I spent a year there as a product manager, near the end, sort of wanting to get a bit more awareness of the business. Had the usual, I think, engineer trap of becoming very solution-minded and not problem-focused, right? So I would go out and talk to people, understand their problems, and then go out and do whatever I wanted to do anyway. So it didn't really work out too well for me. Learned I enjoy the engineering side a lot more.
Engineers never do that, Dan. That really shocks me that people in engineering would build what they want, not what.
It's just so obvious, they don't really know. Customers don't know what they want, They
don't. Only you know, Dan.
Only I know.
Only we know as engineers. So that's funny.
We're all channeling our Steve Jobs, right? We all think we're delusional.
Yeah.
But so I ended up doing a startup after that, and that's when I really learned a lot of the, I would say real broad, full stack software engineering. It was a company called Glossy. We ended up rebranding to Prezi, but if you think about the era, it was around 2011, 2012, and around then there's a new social media network. Feeling like there's a new social media network being launched every day, and our product was let's sort of let people connect to all their social media accounts, ingest everything they're posting, not sort of deduplicate it, right? So you would normally post an image on Facebook and you post the same image on Twitter and Instagram. Google Plus was the thing back then, and we'd say, hey, this is actually the same image, dedupe it, and then make it, and then sort of display them all on a web page that would auto update as you sort of post it across these social channels, and really make this living, breathing version of yourself. For people familiar, it was sort of kind of an about.me, was big at that time, and Flipboard, which was that magazine style layout for your social media feed. So we tried to do that. We got a lot of interest, from people who sign up. They're like, hey, this is awesome, this is great, but no one really ended up using it, which sort of is, makes sense in hindsight. You connect, you get a cool experience, and then you're like, well, what the hell do I do with this thing? So we ended up, doing a little bit of a pivot, selling to a few small colleges, high schools, and they actually have a real problem, a real use case. They would skin it, add their own logo, design it in their school colors, and then sell it to, or position it to, their alumni parents. and we ended up having a bit of a founder, conversation. Like none of us, I think in hindsight, we were all too sort of immature for it. And we're like, well, business, we don't want to do business. We want to do consumer. So we ended up selling it to a pretty small advertising agency. Like another joke I say is, for some businesses, it's, new life money, new generation money, new house money. For me, it was like, new skateboard money. So almost all the value was in learning the tools, right? Because I come from more of a quantitative background, and that dealing with like jQuery and AWS and like dealing with web servers. So like I think that was for me, like a very formative experience. And that's when I ended up consulting for a bit, realized I really liked being part of a team. And then I joined TripleLift, where I've been over like almost 10 years now.
I want to go back to your experience as kind of a founder and going through that process, because you're right. Starting a business can have all sorts of outcomes, but I do think, and I'm glad you pointed it out, that one of the most important lessons I think learned is just the experience of doing it, regardless of the financial outcome. Just going through the process of starting something, going out on your own, having to deal with all the sorts of things that I think you're protected from when you're an employee of a company, having to sort all of that stuff. So yeah, it would be fun to go back and talk about, some of those lessons, not just from technology, but just really kind of the personal side of learning about, what it takes to start a business and go from there. But
yeah,
I do, before we go back in time, I want to hear a little bit more about TripleLift, because, I have to admit, I've never had much exposure to kind of the ad tech space. And so, I've spent some time since you and I last talked doing a little bit of research about what TripleLift does. Obviously, you and I talked a little bit about it, but it's some amazing tech, and y'all are doing some really neat stuff. But just if you can, spend a moment on kind of what it is, what markets you're serving, what y'all are building, because it was really, really interesting when I dug into it a bit.
Yeah, it's like this is like the hardest question to answer, because like what do you do? Because it's and I'll give a previous to why. Like I assume the audience is technical, and generally a lot of people say, "Ooh, advertising, stay away from it." But a positive way of thinking about it is like does power the open internet right now. Like imagine, especially in if you don't not wealthy, you can't pay for Wall Street Journal subscription. A lot of the content you get online is free, and it is paid for through advertising. Like not to mention a lot of small businesses, advertise in order to support their products, and they're the ones that have been affected, pretty heavily by Apple's sort of anti-tracking sort of work. So where we sit, like going back to this, if you think of a typical ad, the way you see it is you go to a website or an app or whatever the case is, it loads the content, and there's a little bit of JavaScript that makes a request to an ad exchange, right? And that ad exchange then takes that request, extracts, information like who is the user, what is the geography, what is the time of the day, what browser are they using, fans it out, to like dozens of different, like we call them like DSPs, like demand side platforms. And then they internally have all these proprietary rules and algorithms and logic, for how do I choose the ad to show and how much do I want to pay for it? So there's some companies, and people joke around like Criteo, that tends to be retargeting. I see a pair of shoes and it follows me around the internet, right? So their bread and butter is coming up with these like data science models to say, I should show the same shoes to someone 3 hours after they've seen the first ad, and then again for the next week, and then they'll sort of drop out. So like companies specialize in that. Some companies are more focused on brand advertising, right? Like I am Coca-Cola. Like you're not going to go in and click on the ad for Coke and buy Coca-Cola online. Like for you, it's more their job is to like make it top of mind. So there's different companies that sort of specialize in these different approaches, and they work with advertising agencies and brands in order to sort of get dollars loaded in and work with them to figure out the targeting. So a typical campaign for Coca-Cola might be, I want to run this ad across the United States. That's like a relatively simple one. You might have other ones which are, well, I'm a Toyota dealership and I know trucks are more popular. Let's say Texas. So I'm going to, run, ads for trucks in Texas. I'm going to run, Prius ads in New York. Some stereotypical example, but generally and this all happens in real time, right? So you land on the webpage, it sends out, every time you see an ad, like that was an auction run. And so you can think of like all the compute that goes into it. And the sort of the most interesting thing, right, is, or one of the more interesting things is the performance here. Like we typically try to get an ad to respond or render within 300 milliseconds. So we get a request, we fan it out, they have to run their evaluation, they send back a response, we apply various business rules. So for example, a common one could be a specific publisher may say, hey, I have an exclusive with Toyota, I don't want to show any other car ads, right? So we could only allow Toyota in that case block for it. and then pass it on to be rendered, displayed. And then we also track, was it in view? Like, was there engagement? And then that sort of goes back and feeds into some of the sort of data science optimization models. So we're doing about 200 billion auctions a day. So it's like pretty massive. And globally. So so it's been this like constant investment over the past 10 years. When we started, and this I think gives a little bit of a sense of the evolution of the product as well. So when we started, we were doing sort of what the industry calls native advertising. And the pitch there was, you go to Facebook and you have these ads that match the look and feel of the content, and yet you go on the internet, even if you're the New York Times and you're a recipe blogger, you'll see the same sort of ads, which doesn't really make sense, right? Like, a lot of these publishers spend an inordinate amount of money and time to make their content look great. Like, why do their ads look so terrible and commoditized? So for us, the sort of the initial product was, let's work with these publishers to create unique templates, right? Like, you may want an ad that's square. That's not typically what you see in the industry. So we would work with them to create these unique templates and work on, I would say, like some computer vision, magic in order to like crop, resize images in order to sort of fit within the desired layout, inherit their typography, their style, and this sort of this idea of like deconstruct the ad components from the way the ad itself was rendered. So that was our first product. Like, we've achieved success there, and over the years, it's been, are there other formats we could run? Let's start doing video. There's also even like the transaction ideas. Like, it used to be very, you can imagine, handheld, right? We needed to have a salesperson go to a brand or an agency and sort of, fight for every dollar. Now, a lot of our work has been, why don't we integrate with these DSPs directly and then have their sales team, sort of push TripleLift in order to make money. So like, that's generally like the big story. And the sort of going forward, like, a lot of the work for us is, how do we do more on video? So we have a pretty big connected television team, and we acquired a company last year that specializes in privacy, right? So how do we take advantage of these privacy changes in order to create better and better products? And I think it's impressive, but when you think of a journey, right? It's not like we were doing 200 billion auctions, a day to start. It was like, you start very small and build a marketplace, and you keep growing. Like, there's some funny stories, like one of them was like, we asked, someone, like, someone's like, I'm willing to pay $2, to show 1,000 of these ads. So typically everything's measured in like terms of thousands, because each ad is worth fractions of a penny. So like, we charge them like $3. And like, hey, how come we got charged more? I'm like, oh, you were part of our beta. Like, lo and behold, everyone got charged more because we had a bug. So it's like that's sort of where we started, right?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's so fascinating to talk to folks who have been part of like these kind of lengthy journeys of companies, because you get to see, kind of the evolution, obviously, of the business and those outcomes, but, of the technology from very early to now. To me, that sounds like an incredibly impressive numbers. I don't know whether that, how that measures in the grand scheme of ad tech, but that number of impressions or I can't remember the exact term used, but to me that's super interesting. Obviously you just shared one story about, kind of, a bug or a mistake that happened, but can you talk just from an architecture perspective? As you said, I think you've been there 13 years, right?
Yeah.
I think
almost roughly.
Okay. So quite some time. What were some of the, without giving away, obviously, all the important details or company secrets, what was kind of the architecture, if you will, of the technology that delivered this then versus, maybe kind of share a little bit of some of the evolution of kind of where you guys are now.
Yeah. So when I joined, the company was about 10 people, and
Wow.
At that point is, half engineering and, half commercial folk and like marketing folk. And so, when you start a marketplace, especially in advertising, it's pretty hard to get immediate scale. So our first version, like sort of our first product when I joined, it was built on top of another company. And I don't want to necessarily name names, but you could think of a company that provides roughly like a way for you to manage your own. Like, I think of it like we were in essence acting as a publisher, right? Like a website owner. And instead we were receiving these requests and then sort of sending them out like through this network. But we had to do a lot of sort of hacks in order to get this idea of native to work, right? It was something like designed for banner ads. But because we had control of both the website, right, that it would be rendered on, and we also had control of the ads themselves, like we use like a variety of like, JSON P hacks to be able to sort of like normally it wouldn't work, right? Because typically what an ad has is HTML. What we instead did is we passed basically a callback, right? We call it we passed back sort of like a JSON call, and we knew that the JavaScript code that would be able to be executed was already on the publisher page. So in that case, we're sort of passing these classes.
But that makes, but I was going to say, but that makes sense. I mean, you're trying, you got 10 people, you're trying to kind of get something going, leverage the tooling, the system, the ecosystem that's already out there. I mean, you didn't say this term, but almost kind of like, hey, we've got to get kind of a minimally viable product kind of out the door. We're not going to, build for year 10 on day one. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah, exactly. And at some point, once there's enough traction volume, you realize that sort of like very much like we love talking about tech debt, right? But like the decisions you've made just make it very hard to sort of innovate and build forward. Like one mental model I really like is like a sort of if you think about like physics, right? There's kinetic energy, potential energy. So it's like, you got to invest in clean code. So then you build up that potential energy. You have a product, feature, or enhancement you want to do. You release it very quickly through kinetic energy. But hey, you're back in the bottom of the mountain, and you just like invest in cleaning up the code base, or like even like in our case, the architecture a bit. So in our case, like we spent quite a lot. Like we knew we were going to move away from it, like at a certain point, and that's sort of what we were doing. I want to say between like 2014-ish to around 2016. And I remember that day pretty clear because it was my birthday. Like we actually did this sort of swap. But generally what we did is we built our own exchange. So in that case, if you think about like a network diagram, it's like our code. Like we run the JavaScript, and then it makes a request to their server, and then their server does all the magic, and then we've sort of loaded all of our content, all of our assets, or all the rules into their system. And I guess we sort of just did a swap. We said, hey, let's release this new JavaScript that's going to live on these publishers' pages and make a request to our system instead, right? Just changing a single URL, and then still have our sort of system proxy basically make a request to the way it used to work back, to their sort of this other sort of company's network. So, and there was this gradual migration of all the integrations that were connected to them. Let's shift them over to directly integrate our exchange. And like that was the joke of like, hey, we're charging too much, we're charging too little. But we did spend a lot of time like around there. Like it's not as simple to build something from scratch, because like part of like something that ended up being like surprisingly, I would say like interesting is like before that, like we didn't have to do any reporting, right? We would get reports from this other system. Now you have to like collect, and we had like all these tricks. We would sample. Hey, collecting data is expensive. Just drop an event 100 times, and then assume everything we, and sort of like approximate like what you need to see. And at some point, we're like, we actually need to collect every event. And then it's like, hey, now it's the rise of Kafka. Now it's the rise of a proper data pipeline. Like, hey, MySQL no longer works. Now you have to like invest. At that point, we invested in Redshift. Like start doing our, really like building up a proper data engineering function. And it's sort of interesting, right? Like, when you're small, you generally have generalists that do a little bit of everything. And as you get larger, you have specialists that understand the particular sort of area and they have their own expertise. And I think the challenge, like for a business, how could you, I guess, grow them in tandem, right? Because you don't want to have specialized needs without specialists. And you also don't want to sort of have the inverse, right? You don't want to necessarily hire specialists that can really support where you are. So I think it was this like healthy balance, right? Of like really like, hey, we need to build some data engineering skills. Let's build expertise and hire for it.
There's so much to dive into there because, I think in the companies I've been a part of, and certainly at Cockroach, this can be true too. I mean, when you start small, you're right. Everybody is a generalist, right? Everybody is kind of has a front seat at the show, or a seat at the table, whatever you want to describe. And people get very involved. And then, as businesses grow, you're absolutely right. Like you start to need to have specialists, and those people that were really good at everything, and were part of everything, need to kind of pick a direction a little bit. And organizationally, I wonder if you found that to be somewhat difficult, where folks who had been kind of very engaged at, in all parts of the company, the decisions are now having to kind of pull back and focus on one thing. I think that like organizationally, I've seen that being somewhat of a challenge where people are like, hey, I miss being part of everything. Now you want me to only do this? What happened? But I think it's part of the natural evolution of companies is that you have to get specialized in order to keep growing.
No, that's definitely true. And we've had, people leave for it. And I think it's an honest conversation. It's, and a lot of people say, hey, this is not the company I joined 3 years ago. Some days I feel like that. Right. I think to your point, like it is natural. I do think a lot of people find interest in specialization. Like we have a great engineer, right, who did a little bit of everything. And like he'll, readily admit that he doesn't do like front end. And like he's become our expert, working on this real-time bidding system and the exchange and like optimizing like the low-level Java. And like it's sort of a good sign, right? When you you use an open source library, like we use Netty, and at some point you realize, hey, there's this issue in Netty. I'm going to commit it upstream and like fix a bug down, in their system and down the line. Like, and it's good, right? People, some people like that, right? This idea of like this like depth and optimization. Other people do stay generalists and just like jumping around and fixing whatever comes and learning whatever comes. There's probably a lot of these parallels too. Like open source probably encouraged this idea of specialization, right? Because like if you have to write everything from scratch, the thing like 20, 30 years ago, like you just weren't able to create like the amazing products we all create now. So it's sort of like the flip side. Like I don't remember, someone told me, or I read this, but it's like the idea of you compare it with medicine, right? Like you used to have 100 years ago, there was this thing called a doctor. And like now you have cardiologists and psychiatrists and podiatrists. So maybe we're seeing the same thing with software engineering.
No, I think
there's
it's such
this whole
a good
AI
point.
angle too, and like what does that mean?
Yeah,
but
it interesting conversation.
I do think people like you want to give people opportunities, right, to like discover and see what they enjoy, and then give them work that they both want to master, but also that supports and grows the business.
One thing I also wanted to touch on, because again, it's very top of mind for us, and I think it's top of mind for a lot of the companies that that we talk to. And interestingly enough, I got back yesterday from the Gartner Data and Analytics Summit down in Orlando, and so to some extent, I think this was a thread throughout a lot of the conversations, and that's observability, right? So you kind of said, hey, we were using this tool, they were providing us all the reports, I had all this great insight into what was happening. When I move away from that, I have to kind of build my own. I mean, I'm using the term observability. You may have a different term, but I know building a product here at Cockroach, that's been one of the really key and important things that we've done. It's one thing to build a product, but if you don't really know what's happening, inside the product, how it's being consumed, are issues occurring? Are they not occurring? All sorts of stuff. That observability becomes, I think, really critical in kind of building, a wonderful product. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that been as an important a piece of your puzzle as I think it has been for us?
I'm actually very glad you brought it up, because I feel like definitely so, and I'll give some anecdotes and maybe some thoughts on it. One thought is it's rare, and maybe from what I've seen, like it's rare that a product manager, would sort of prioritize observability. And I think we got lucky because we didn't have product managers for quite a while. So a lot of the time it was, engineers getting exposed to problems directly. And, the first time an engineer gets an issue, they're like, oh, screw it, I'll just deal with it. Second time they do it, whatever, I'll deal with it. And then the third time, they'll be like, let me just build a solution for it. Good. And there's a lot to be said about, just escalating things directly to like engineering teams, because they really are the most, capable of solving it. And I think we've invested a lot in these sort of like self-serve tools just to help us address problems. Like some examples of the ones we've done is like we created, like for every auction, there's a lot of steps, right? There is what we receive, how do we enhance it? So one, like an example of enhancement we do is when we receive a request, it typically has a cookie, to identify like the user, but that's, unique to our domain, right? Because cookies are tied to a domain, and we need to map it to the partners we work with. Because if you're, let's say, a buyer like the Trade Desk, like you don't care if it's TripleLift user 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You want to know that it's Trade Desk user ABCDE. So, we have to take this request, do like a very quick lookup. Like we use Aerospike, so like a pretty fast database used in like ad tech. Augment the ad request. Then we attach like all sorts of rules to it, and like which buyers are eligible. How long did they take to respond? What creative did they respond with? How much are they willing to pay? Who paid the most, right? Like various data science, like predictions around performance, and then we determine when. So we created a pretty clever idea, like a debug auction, right? If you knew the right tricks and you were on the VPN, the right network, you'd be able to, add something to the URL, and you'd get like maybe like if you printed it out, it was probably like a 20-page doc, right, of like all the deals that happened. But the way we did it, it was like this work in progress, right? And especially it was like pretty hacky. And at some point, people realized, hey, this is actually incredibly valuable. And someone at some point had this idea of, hey, I'm going to create an interface called, debuggable. And so you just added, right, to a particular, a bit of code sort of in our execution chain. And like, lo and behold, suddenly we have like pretty robust sort of reporting auction. And that's like for a particular auction. Like the other big piece we've done, I actually think it goes, like I like, everyone's gonna have their own reasons for success, and it could be right, could be wrong, but I think a big part of it was our investment in observability, and especially co-locating. commercial metrics with sort of engineering technical metrics. Because it's relatively straightforward to take Datadog, New Relic, like Honeycomb, and they give you a ton of instrumentation on the code, albeit it's pretty expensive. But it's a lot of work to then go in and say, how do I also push in sort of the commercial metrics we have? So in our case, it would be something like, how many dollars are we making per second, by partner? For our publishers, how much are publishers making per second? For our ads themselves, like what is their render rate? Like 98% render is great. Like, is there a combination where it drops, below 90%? In that case, throw an alert, and we use, PagerDuty for things like that. But like a big part of it is really getting into a single system, because then you can say, oh, I can understand why. Oh, our spend dropped. Oh, because latency in our US West region increased this much. Like one or the other. Like, I mean, especially when you're dealing with incidents and stressed out and like everyone's trying to find answers, like getting that information available and presence incredibly valuable.
No, I think it, obviously, you guys have such a focus on the customer and consumer experience. But even for us, it's the same kind of thing. I mean, this ability to I think, combine the data of, the product, the insights, how are we serving this request, or, various other kind of technical things that we're monitoring with, other more customer facing, user facing interactions, and being able to pull all of this data together to have some insight into whether things are going well or not well, whether this is an area of the product we need to focus on or pull away from. It's so critical, but it's so hard to do, I think, well. I think this is one of the things that, people who have really cracked like the SaaS algorithm, have figured out how to marry all of this data about interactions, to make their product better. And it's difficult. It's one that we're working really, really hard on. And I think, like, to your point, we were lucky in that very early on, we, made an effort to track and observe lots of things within the product stack that maybe others would not have had the forethought to do. And it's helped a lot. Because if not, as a former engineer, I was so panicked that, and by the way, I
what's an engineer always an current?
Yeah, I was going to say, I better correct that, because I actually still enjoy writing a lot of code. But, I was always so panicked that something I did was going to cause issues. Yeah. And you're lucky if the issues that your code creates are obvious, because it's easy to fix. But a lot of times, the issues that we find that really plague people are very, very difficult to identify. And again, that kind of having really well thought out observability helps give some confidence that if something does sneak in, you can get to it and resolve it.
We we benefit in some cases from, every industry has its own challenges. But what's, I would say, easier than most for us is, at the end of the day, you're dealing with ads, and each ad is, once again, worth fractions of a penny. So, if you show an ad or don't show an ad the wrong way, you just have to majority right at the time. And what that has afforded us is this ability to sort of test in production. I know everyone has pretty strong views on testing and how to do it. We benefited a lot from being from basically diverting 1% of our production traffic to what we call a staging environment. One staging also means very different things to different people. But for us, it's running, it's connected to the production, I would say state, but it's running a new version of the code. And it's useful because so many, probably very similar to you, it's the problems the issues happen on the edges. In our case, it could be something oh, in this version of iOS on Safari, this sort of video format on this publisher is not interacting nicely with their HTML. It's they upgrade, let's say their jQuery library. It's those sorts of examples. And we have a long ways to go to make that better, right? I love this idea of this, pure, this self-learning system that says, hey, this combination of things used to be perfect, and all of a sudden I'm seeing weird anomalous behavior. The problem with that is that there's just so much noise. And how do you sort of differentiate the two? But that is sort of an area we leaned in pretty heavily on, relatively early, right? It's hey, we benefit from being able to run in production. So instead of trying to come up with, unit tests for every single combination of things, let's just dump in there, look at the high level stats, collect all the data we can, make it easy for our team to dig into it and analyze it.
So, at Cockroach, one of the things that we talk a lot about is, resilience and obviously from a database perspective, creating a data architecture that can't go down. And the reason we do that is, we find that at least our customers, outages are big deal. Like you don't want your database and ultimately your applications to go down. It can be a serious thing. How do you all think about resilience of like your architecture? You know, what happens if and when things go down? What do you all do about that? Or how do you think about kind of those problems? In some industries, it's not as important as others.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, kind of how you think about those kinds of topics.
Yeah, so for us, it's for sure a journey. So when we're out, like you can think of like the impact to us, like what happens if we're down? Oh, so as a company, we don't make money. So, that's one risk. Risk two is, our customers don't make money.
Yeah.
And advertisers, can't spend money. Like in some cases, we do have sort of obligations for customers to stay up, especially depending on the type of product they use. So, once again, like we endeavor to do as much as we can. And like probably similar to you probably have quite a lot of outages that you look back on and you'd be like, what were we thinking? Right? It's this constant sort of period, like improving things. So the way we think about it is maybe like I'm probably going to maybe give you a high level view of like 4 different systems. And
sure.
I'm sure there's more, but like one way of thinking about it is like we have the code, that's generally going to be living on publishers' pages and rendering the sort of the ads themselves. That's JavaScript. It's static. We use a CDN for things like that.
That makes sense.
We have this real-time bidding system, and that needs to stay up all the time because that's what's listening to these requests, running these auctions. And we've spent a ton of time making that resilient. So I mentioned we're running in 4 different regions. We have like regional sort of resiliency there, right? So if one region goes out, we're able to shift traffic automatically to another region. You'll fail over to another region. And the other sort of, I don't want to say it's like innovation because like it seems maybe like obvious, but it's like we basically try to make this application as stateless as possible and sort of minimize any writes it needs to do. So the only like output it produces to like a state sort of database is Kafka. So we're using a Kafka Nest as a database, but it does not connect to MySQL. It does not connect to anything. Instead, what we have is a separate application that sort of reads the state from all sorts of places, right? It reads it from MySQL. Like we use like Mongo, like we have like a few other services that we sort of connect to. So it pulls a state, creates like these giant protobuf objects, uploads them to S3, and then it says, hey, sort of these instances on the edges, and we're running about like on any given day, like it fluctuates, day over day. Or like hour by hour, depending on like sort of like, the volume, but about 1,000, like between 1,000 and 2,000. And what they do is, they get an update. Hey, I have a new list of ads, or I have a new list of rules for my publishers. Fetch them from S3, load it internally, and say suddenly you have a new state. So that's kind of nice, right? Because it means each application is, like stateless if sort of you didn't have data, updated 5 minutes ago. Whatever, use the most recent, healthy state. So this idea of not sort of coupling your systems too much and understand, like, I guess investing in degraded performance. Like, what does degraded performance look like?
Yeah.
And like, how do you avoid complete and utter failure? We have a data pipeline, and similar to that, if our data pipeline is delayed, it's okay so long as the data is in Kafka and makes its way to S3. And at that point, right, we have a lot of our batch jobs take over. And then the last piece is, the most one from like I would say sort of managing the state, right? Like various UIs and APIs where customers, internal, external, could go in and modify these rules. And if that goes down, the rule, it's like it's not terrible, right? Because what that means is just the system's going to run on the most recent state, but new ads or like new campaigns, like it ends up sort of blocking like future sort of revenue future. So, but it doesn't necessarily break the existing sort of operating sort of performance. I don't know. Does that help?
No, absolutely. And I'm curious about one thing because again, this is something we talk about a lot. I think is, or people ask us about is, and I'm just curious. Do you test failure? In other words, do you, as part of a regular process, like try to kill these parts of the application and see how they respond? Because I think one of the things we found is that people oftentimes will talk about, hey, I need to have this scenario or be resilient to this. But the real world testing of like catastrophic failure doesn't, it's not easy to do, by the way. I mean, it's really actually quite hard to do. I'm just curious. I know, and we've talked to some other folks who are starting to kind of think pretty creatively about how to like inject failure into their systems. Just curious, is this something you guys are routinely testing, or is this, and maybe by extension, have you experienced kind of really significant outages, and what did that look like?
So I guess to answer your first question, like not as much as we probably should. And I think and I'll give you an example of failure that we did have. So part of why is over the years, we've run into so many issues that, we've sort of like resolved them that way.
Yeah.
And I think we have a good mental model for like the way
Yeah.
the system communicate. And
Yeah.
we've sort of decoupled them in a way that makes sense. So for, like in our case, like, in some cases, like I know microservices, used to be big, maybe not as big anymore, but like that ends up being a much harder like thing to reason about. You could actually think of our architecture as being a bit more of a hub and spoke, maybe, right? So there's this hub, this sort of real-time bidding system, and you could think of it as like it's a pretty beefy Java application. Like I like it's not necessarily a monolith; it's like a giant but it's close, right? It just does a lot, and the way like if any system on the outside fails, like it'll just keep serving ads, doing its thing. It sort of doesn't really matter. Right. So in that case, we have monitoring on its integrations and then we fix like the system that feeds into it. But the system itself is sort of stable. And like we've invested a ton in like making sure like that's what like, that example of rolling out the staging, the 1% of traffic, like we'll also run it, when we deploy to each region, like one at a time, like deploy to Asia first, because that's generally has lower traffic. Like look at the performance, compare it. We have various Grafana dashboards that look at like stats and like, spend per second. So once again, focusing on a lot of these commercial metrics, and if things look good, then we'll sort of roll it out to Europe and like US West Coast and like US East. So like that's been sort of our model. I think part of it is because our industry like is, I would say, like a bit more tolerant of failure. Like if we were doing like fintech or like medtech, we probably wouldn't necessarily have a similar approach. We'd probably be much more like invested in like real failure. But I think for us, it's generally, and we've been okay. Like the most recent like major outage we've had, and this is like embarrassing, but we, like I mentioned, we have like some,
everybody has them, Dan. It's all right.
Yeah. Well, so we use data science models, right, to bring more value. So an example could be we try to predict, right, what would the performance be of a particular ad, and then we try to give our customers sort of opportunities that we think their campaigns will do well. And lo and behold, our data science team uses sort of like we use Databricks and Spark to do some training, and Python. Like we use Onyx, so ONX. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I've heard of it. It's like an interface, right, where a data scientist could run code in Python and train a model in Python. It sort of serializes the results of that model. It could be a random forest or regression into this like Onyx format. And then our exchange, which is written in Java and sort of uses JNI to like evaluate C code, sort of loads that in. And you get that like fast evaluation, right? Because you don't want to be evaluating in Python, especially for this, real-time bidding system to like massive scale, but it's okay for you to do training in Python, right? Because that's like a one-time sort of operation. So in that case, lo and behold, the Python library got updated automatically, right? Because hey, that's what good open source is. You release a new version, and it caused some break in like this Python like C evaluation, and like that took down like a good chunk of us. Like really, right? Because we just simply didn't put in version, and it's one of those things that we didn't. And the fix for it was obvious. You could probably, you and I could like brainstorm like half a dozen different solutions, right? Like what is it? Oh, well, obviously the real thing is like you should put in every version. Like what else? Oh, well, you should not launch this model. Like try to read it first before deploying it, right? Like, basically simulate it in the production like environment before you actually push it to every instance. It's like, hey, if, don't let the model crash, right? Like in that case, wrap it in an exception or something wrong. The problem, right, is this Java to C interface. Like those are the things that cause problems, right? Because, C tends to not be like the most memory safe language. And when you're dealing with like one language to another language to another language, like that tends to be sort of
so. Just out of curiosity, for you personally, I mean, I know you've mentioned JavaScript a few times. You just mentioned Java. Are there particular languages that you kind of have gravitated toward, or are those kind of the principal languages that y'all use? I'm a former, or I keep saying former. I'm not a former. I might go write code today. What am I talking about?
Future engineer.
Future and current. Definitely Java. I definitely used to do tons and tons of JavaScript. So just kind of curious, like, if those are technologies y'all still strongly believe in, or have you moved on to all these other fancy things that people like to talk about now?
So we generally let teams, have some freedom in what they choose. And I think it tends to be around, their particular, I would say like industry standards. So like the data team, right, that does data engineering, like, they use Spark. So they're a pretty big user of Python and Scala, right? Because that's generally, what the teams use. Data science, using Python. Like our full stack teams will use, TypeScript and JavaScript, right, for a lot of what they're doing. And this real-time bidding team is like pretty deep into Java. And I know Java has like a bad rap, but it's also, because, from 20 years ago, like it was pretty verbose. Like these days, like you get quite a lot of performance. Like it's great performance. Like it's not as verbose as people think. Like it's becoming more and more functional. Like some of our code, in Java right now looks very much like, modern clean Scala code. Like we're using a ton of like I'm gonna like butcher it a bit, but we're doing like a fair amount of like reactive programming, like leaning into like Spring Flux, like digging into, just making it easier for us to really write code. Very much, in JavaScript, you have like a series of callbacks, but it looks a lot more elegant and clean and, supported in Java.
So do you guys use Spring?
Yeah, like, parts of Spring, but generally,
Parts of Spring? Yeah, I've been
trying to
big
do
Spring user.
more of that. But yeah, we're big fans. We're like we use, like I mentioned, like Netty under the hood. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's like great technology. It's
it's been around for a while too, hasn't it?
It's been around for a while.
Pretty stable. What JavaScript libraries are? I think you mentioned early jQuery, which brought back lots and lots of good memories. I'm trying to think of what some of the other ones were way back in the day that we used to.
There was like Domo or
something
like that. Yeah.
And there was some other one. What was it that? It'll come to me. But JavaScript's fun. TypeScript I haven't quite gotten to yet, but I know that's kind of where a lot of things are headed. It just makes it, I think, a little bit easier to.
I have so many thoughts on like front end. Like I don't know, front end. Once again, like my background is more like on the back end side of things.
Yeah.
But front end is so complicated. Like it's sort of sad, right? Because everyone's like, "Oh, front end, like that's the easy thing." Like I actually think it's incredibly hard. Like it's like, well, yeah, it's tough. Like one is everyone's gonna have an opinion. Like if you have some thing hidden away in the bowels of like Java code, like no one's gonna know. But something looks off on a page, or you want to reuse a component here and there. Like how will it actually look? Like a lot of what we're doing, is like moving a lot of our applications, on the front end from sort of very old Angular, right, to modernized to like Next. And that requires like which functionality is even used. Oh, we never really instrumented that much of the front end. Or like how do we have multiple teams? Like, oh, we'd like to have a consistent experience across multiple products. How do we organize our teams to do that? Hey, what if one team needs to upgrade to a different version? How will that work in this like single page app with like slightly different like team that's not ready to upgrade? How do their components work? Like it's like I think for us it is somewhat of a new muscle. Like because we've done, I would say, like JavaScript, but that has to be much more of this, run any browser across any environment, not this world of, hey, let's create like amazing, sort of customer facing apps that have like pretty complex workflows.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with your sentiment, by the way. I think people think front end is like just writing HTML code or something in CSS, but some of the most talented engineers I have ever known, absolutely terrified of doing front end work because it's incredibly complex. And I almost think to a fault at times, like there have been, some of the tooling and technologies that have become popular, I think in recent years in the front end have, I know are enormously powerful, but almost like, make things a little too hard to read and reason about, which isn't necessarily a good thing.
But that's engineering, right? It's like comes in cycles. Like even a lot right now, there's a lot of this work around like combining the front end and the back end, like trying to create like a single framework that like Next does a little bit of both, right? It's like lets you also like create the back and forth. But yeah, like I miss, I guess, go back to like the jQuery days, like being able to like make a code and refresh your page and like lo and behold, things work. Now it's like Webpack and build and.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. It's crazy stuff. And the other thing too is, you mentioned it, like I have found myself in the work that I do now spending almost, going back to more simple front ends and moving a lot more toward just monolithic, applications. There's a lot of value in just being able to build something quickly and not have to introduce all the complexity of all this other stuff that sometimes happens with microservices. And
there's a theory that microservices are more of like organizational. It's like solving organizational problems rather than technology problems. And I think, as with most things, obviously there's like shades of gray, but I think there's some truth to it. Like, well, our approach has been like approaching like some of these services, it's like, I don't like saying microservice because it means different, but like just being reasonable about services and like understanding boundaries. Part of the problem you never really run into is like people disagree on what the boundaries are. And like that causes like a fair amount of like problems. But you could still write your code in a way that makes it easy to decouple it if needed, right? So that's sort of been our approach, right? Like think more about like the interfaces, like try to make the method calls, like have not try to be a stateless, like trying to adopt a lot of these like better practices. So if we need to split it at some point, like we'll be able to, rather than
I
of
totally
prematurely
agree.
optimizing.
Yeah, this like religious zeal around like it must be
Well, that's the
this
danger.
pattern or this framework. It's like, come on.
I think when you get bitten by too many things, you become more of a, I guess, pragmatist, right? You realize.
I agree. Well, listen, Dan, we're kind of running up on the hour, and I hate to take more time than I deserve. Maybe just as we kind of close out, maybe talk to us a little bit about, because there's so many other topics I wanted to get to, by the way, but maybe we'll have you on as a guest for a second. I'd be
glad
time.
to.
We can dive.
This is fun. It's like I think better in conversation. Just going back and forth, because I inspire a thought, you inspire a thought.
Yeah, you do. I can mental notes of like, oh man, I wish we had time to cover this. This is really interesting. But I do want to leave time, because I've ended a couple of the podcasts like this. For us, it's the beginning of our fiscal year. Although maybe I can't say that as much anymore, because time is progressing rather quickly. It's like I may have to come up with a new question, but nonetheless, it's spring. The flowers are blooming. It's a time of optimism and looking forward in future. What are some things maybe that whether it TripleLift or even personally, some things you're kind of looking forward to for the coming year?
Yeah, I think given everything that's going on, it's easy, right, to be a bit bearish. But I also think I think there's always opportunity and constraints. So like for us, we have a couple of different things. One is that I know I'm sure finance will want me saying it or not, but it's generally for a lot of companies, right? It's this idea of like, could we do more with less? How could we be more cost efficient? And I don't know, I like this idea of like cost optimization. I generally enjoy it, right? Like, are there ways for us to like optimize this system? Do we even use this system? Hey, we used to not sample here. Hey, let's start sampling and like see what the impact is. So like I do think using this opportunity, right, as a way to sort of get better at the operational excellence, because when the market recovers, which it inevitably will, we'll be in a much better position, like sort of to execute. So I'm generally excited about sort of just bringing more rigor, right, to our sort of cost. And we get to work on like pretty cool technologies. Like we've rolled out like Spot instances more and more, right? We're on AWS, so being able to like re-architect our systems to support Spot, like that's exciting. The other big one is obviously was more on product side. Like we acquired a company last year called 1+X, and sort of their pitch, I'm going to butcher it somewhat, but sort of what the area they play in is coming up with like privacy safe ways of doing like audience, like creating audiences, right? You saw, I don't know, you read these few articles, you must be interested in cars, like sort of that sort of idea. And we acquired them in order to build this great product together, and like we're sort of reaching this point of like closer integration, right? Coming up with this joint product, like launching it. So it's exciting to see how that goes. Like there's always excitement, on our new product lines, connected television. Sort of, I don't know, like there's the way I think about it is like, the overall market may contract, right? But it's sort of our chance to get more market share. And so when sort of, it's like maybe like bigger slice of the pie, and the pie will continue growing, and sort of will expand there. Like for me personally, there's just, I don't know, I wish I was younger, and like had more energy, like fewer kids, but like just everything that's happening, like AI, like I guess I'm a techno optimist, and like I used to, like I'm sure a lot of people like will have vendors reaching out. It was like, hey, we use AI ML, and like 4 years ago, I'd be like, this is some garbage, like AMI is a buzzword. Like there's obviously something real here. Like I've used it. Like I like Copilot. Like I've been like playing around with it. So there's like, what does it actually mean? And it's, I don't know, like some days, and they're like awesome. You still have this like meaning of like both terrifying, and now it's like amazing. So I have both of those. I fluctuate between those from 1 minute to another minute.
Oh, I tell you, I mean, this summit this week, I mean, I just did, I did the loops around the exhibit hall. And I mean, I don't think there was a single booth, maybe with the exception of ours, that didn't reference ML AI in some way, shape, or form. I mean, it seems to just be taking over the entire vernacular of what we're doing. It's interesting, exciting. I still don't know what to do with it all, but it's certainly out there.
Like I'm an optimist. Like I think we'll figure it out. And I do think it'll hopefully, help all of us like do our jobs better.
And so last question, I always like to poke at people, especially people who have books in their background, as I do. Is there something back there that you love? It's kind of your go-to book, or is there something on there that you haven't read yet that you're getting to, or is this just decoration? Any answer is good.
I'm generally not a decorative person, but there's also some of the books are my wife's. But I know. So the book right above my head, I like it's like Edward Tufte. I don't know if you've
No,
familiar with it, but he's like a big infographics guy. And I don't know,
interesting.
like for someone that like does backend, I have a very good appreciation for like good design, right? And like
Yeah.
information density and like how could you showcase information in a good way. So like that's like something I enjoy, like leafing through. It's like has good production value. Like a book I'm currently reading, it's not on the shelf because I've shifted to Kindle, which I sometimes regret. Like I wish I could have physical books, but I wish I didn't have to like move them or like store them. But I like the feel of a book. But it's like amp it up because I know some people. It's by the CEO of Snowflake, like Frank Slootman. And I know I read, like business books. Like for me, they're like watching an action movie. Like I sort of know what it's about. I don't have to be like 100% engaged. It's like light reading, so I like it. But I don't know, it's forced me to think a little bit differently, right? He's very much this like straight shooter. Like even by the name, right? You could see sort of get what he's getting at.
Yeah,
and he's like instead of thinking about like next week, think about today. Just very much like get rid of a lot of the nonsense, right? And the optics of what we're doing, and instead like focus on like great work. Align incentives. Like make sure your sales team and your sports team and engineering team are all working towards the same goals. Like that sort of
thing. I agree with you. I love reading kind of the business books too. I mean, I've got all sorts of different. I kind of have like I try to read like a couple different books at the same time. Like I'll have like one that's just fun and entertaining, and then one that's like a self improvement. I hate to use the term self help, but just something to help kind of make me better.
I did. I go through like sci-fi books too, like periods where I like like binge on them, like read the series.
Me too.
I don't know, like as a kid, like I think they're somewhat sad, right? Because like as a kid, you'd be like, oh, the science, this unknown, and like these days, maybe there's a little bit less ambition, maybe not.
Yeah.
But like 50 years ago, or I guess 100 years ago, right, when they had all sci-fi books, time travel and this and that.
I know, it's fascinating stuff, and a lot of good books out there. By the way, it's good. It's kind of it's fun to think about the what ifs, what the future holds.
Yeah, of course.
Well, listen, Dan, this was a wonderful conversation. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. I really enjoyed our conversation, and again, hope maybe in the future we'll get you on for a second episode to kind of finish some of the things we started.
Yeah, well, thank you again. I really enjoyed the conversation with you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you're a fan of the show, be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get every new episode in your feed as they're available. Also, rate us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform. If you like what you've heard, you can also watch Big Ideas in App Architecture on our YouTube page, linked in the description. Thanks again.